Live, so we can start.
Okay, wonderful. Good evening, everyone. Actually, a quick question, bookkeeping question for Rajesh, if he's still on.
Yeah, I'm on. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we're about half an hour behind in time. How do you want to handle this? You want to extend by half an hour, or you want to?
No, I think we can. I know this panel deserves the audience, so folks will stay on as long as they can. But I think in the interest of getting the most out of this panel, we should stay on as long as the panelists are available.
As long as the panelists, yeah. I thought we have questions from the audience as well. So let's kind of try to make this very interactive and really start kind of peppering us with questions as you start hearing the panelists talk.
Hi, Inder. Hey, Rajesh, apologies. I may have to drop off in 15 minutes or so I'll stay on for the first 15-20 minutes. Sorry about that.
Maybe you can go
for so let's kick this off then. I mean, I think this is really a one from Manish's talk, right? So I hope you guys heard Manish speak, and he talked a little bit about what TSDSI was trying to do with open source and white box solutions, and really kind of understand the potential, the maturity of open box solutions, the open source solutions, the applicability within the Indian 5G ecosystem. The relevance to the standardization process, the implications for startups, how in fact the whole Indian ecosystem can be impacted positively, hopefully, by the emergence of open source and white boxes. And that was really the focus of the work that that Manish talked about, which what we want to do in this panel is really have a kind of let's say an informal exploration of that, and get our distinguished panelists to opine on various aspects of this and give us some of their insight and viewpoints. So really the model very much, right? I mean, we've been motivated by looking at some of the large carriers, globally, AT&T being a prime example, that have kind of formally declared that they will do everything open source and with white boxes. At least that's the strategic direction, right? So they are not going to go to proprietary vendors. They will try to disaggregate and rely on open source. And in fact, have actually not just made some of these comments in a vacuum, that actually walked the talk, if you will, by contributing to open source and creating open source initiatives in many areas. So I mean, AT&T is just one example. Many other carriers have made similar pronouncements. So let's kind of start the panel. What I'm going to do is maybe ask a few framing questions and then perhaps open it up to questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do is start with a kind of a very general framing question, and let's use this question really for the panelists to, perhaps give their general opinion on this area, and then also introduce themselves. Those that haven't introduced themselves already, I think Sachin and Raymond already are known to us, but the others have not had a chance to talk about where they're from, what they're doing. So perhaps as you answer the first question, you can talk a little bit about your not just your perspective, but also introduce yourselves and perhaps give a little bit of background in terms of what molds your viewpoints. So the first question I really want to kick things off with is really the maturity of the open source ecosystem, right? Do you think the open source and white box solution space, the ecosystem, is mature? What should mature enough for carriers to actually deploy? AT&T seems to think that. Is that a reality or a myth? And if you think it is mature, what aspects of the 5G space do you think are mature enough? Manish kind of divided things up into access, transport, applications. perhaps you can talk a little bit about where you think open source and white box solutions are mature enough to be deployed in real world settings. So let's start off with that question, and maybe we'll give, since Sachin has to leave, maybe what we can do is let him talk a little bit first. I think he's already introduced himself, so he doesn't need to spend time on that. You can perhaps just plunge into the answer, and then we can go around the room and have others contribute.
Sure, thank you, Inder. So I think I already alluded to this during the talk. In terms of disaggregation, there's already quite a few proof points available around radio and compute disaggregation. So virtualized implementations of RAN, as well as having disaggregated radio units, even potentially white box, right? So you saw an announcement from Facebook tip. There's other white box radio designs becoming available. So I think that is fairly well along. There's a lot of momentum there. I think around open, so I do want to draw a distinction between open and open source, right? So open, obviously having a modular architecture with open interfaces absolutely makes sense. Open source is a way of realizing an open architecture, right? So it may, and very likely the majority of deployments will be open, but not open source, right? In the sense that they will be built using commercial components that are not open source.
Sorry to interrupt, Sachin, but I mean, I think the question really was about open source, right? I mean, I understand that what you're trying to do is disaggregate and create open interfaces where perhaps they didn't exist before. But the question really is around what we're thinking about is there, I mean, AT&T in particular has claimed that there is an open source ecosystem emerging that can actually make a lot of, make a lot of the 5G deployments, completely not just open but open source, right? And so the question is that something that you think is likely to happen, particularly in the O-RAN space?
I'm not sure. So I think definitely there will be white box designs, open source designs for the hardware, for the RU, for low band, so sub 6 gigahertz deployments. But anything with massive MIMO and anything else probably requires proprietary innovation there that will still need to happen. There will definitely be open source implementations around the cloud infrastructure, right, that people are already trying, but the actual implementations of the DU and the CU itself, unlikely in the given time frame that they'll be based completely on open source, right? So I think that will take some time to catch up. But there will be open source platforms. Let me put it this way. I think long story short, you will have open source platforms that folks will evaluate, but the actual solution on top of an open source platform will still probably be a commercial proprietary implementation.
Fair enough. How about who would like to go next? Maybe we could have someone who hasn't spoken before. Maybe Ravikanth, would you like to perhaps give your perspective? You have to get yourself off mute.
Ravi, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm on mute. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry for that. Yeah. I work in ALTRAN. So what we build is we provide solutions to our customers, right, in the wireless communication network and transport different aspects of network. And our perspective is that, okay, if you look at this, right, maybe just for context, right? So if you look at when you talk about open source or talk about white box solutions, when you talk about networks, there are 5 key aspects to be considered, right? One, it has to be reliable, open, interoperable, secure, and also the automation. So these are the guiding principles around which you can see the 5G networks evolving towards, right? Now, if you break this down into 3 pieces, right, core, transport, networking, or the RAN part, right, what we see is maturity level goes from is less towards the RAN, and that's where probably the paradigm shift is happening towards going towards this open source or the kind of these 5 principles. As not really open source, the 5 principles. And as a part of 5 principles, white box and open source become one of the what you call the aspect of the considered realization of those 5 principles, right? The one question what you asked is also on the white box part, right? So white box, we take a RAN perspective. No, it all depends on deployment. As Sachin mentioned, once again, you have a small cells, enterprise, private networks. Yes, you could have actually kind of a standard kind of a design. You could have white box kind of a solutions which we are working with the customers. There are actual solutions available, right? And then if you go to the macro networks, once again, the openness comes into picture. The interoperability comes into picture, but then not really an open hardware per se, right? Because when you talk about the macro networks in the radio part, that's where kind of proprietariness comes in. So it all breaks down into what kind of use case you are talking about, what kind of market you're targeting about. That's one piece on the white box part. And the second part is an open source. I do agree with what Sachin mentioned, and that's what customers we are working with also are looking towards. So while AT&T is an example, right, and it's an own app kind of an option available for the SMO kind of a thing, which they're pushing for, right? But then we talk about open source. There are multiple factors which come into picture when we talk about open source. One is what is the support and maturity model, what is the security aspect. So a lot of these questions, and what are the kind of features which come in, how does it align to your requirements roadmap. So open source could be an enabler to start with, but then openness and then the kind of white box options is something probably it will take off with. Open source could be just an enabler which will help you to take towards those principles. So that's way we think that it could be going towards.
Okay.
Inder?
Gilad, you want to share your views?
Absolutely. 1 minute for the sakes of the few of you who don't know who I am. So I'm Gilad. I'm the CEO of a company called ASOCS. Very interesting to see the development of discussions. We started out on this Cloud RAN journey about 9 years ago in almost, I dare say, a science project by China Mobile and Intel. Signed one of Sachin Katti's first checks for XRAN. Thank you very much, Sachin, for putting us in the plaque. Actually, you put Ericsson and Nokia, who joined last, literally arm twisted by the big operators. But I guess that's the way of the world. So all kidding aside, speed forwarding now into 2020 and on, and specifically about open source, I think there's a little bit of a misconception about what would be the role of open source in networks. So I dare say, and this is not an original observation, that about 95% of the next generation networks will be built on open source. But that does not mean that the networks consume open source. There's a big confusion. Companies such as ASOCS, such as ALTRAN, such as others, still will use and are increasingly using open source in order to expedite their development process. But carriers such as Bharti Airtel and enterprises such as Daimler are not going to consume directly open source. Somebody needs to deliver that in a qualified, packaged way. And the obvious example always was, if that would have been the case in Linux, Red Hat would never have existed. So there's going to be the new Red Hats, companies who will emerge by integrating open source at carrier scale. There's going to be folks like VMware who embrace open source, but just at the level that doesn't touch their core businesses. And there's going to be the cloud providers. And I think we did not really touch enough on that. And again, just 1 minute of that. All the work that was done by Sachin and his group, actually in the NFV world and ORAN world, all it actually did was open up the door and pave the way for the large-scale cloud providers to step into telco. Because at the end of the day, most operators, and I'm not talking specifically about Jio, Bharti Airtel, who have a very unusual tap into India programming talent, will have to consume this new virtualized world in the way that any other enterprise consumes it, and that comes through Azure and Amazon and Google. So the real interesting trend is the fact that, yes, ORAN has opened up the door. Yes, open source will accelerate R&D. But at the end of the day, the real winners of our industry will be the trillion-dollar cloud players, which their names we all know. And operators will team up, and we're already seeing that, and they should team up in a very smart way because, again, very few, maybe 5 or 6 operators on the planet will be able to consume software without intervention. And most of us, whether it's at the enterprise or any operator which is smaller than the next number of users, will have to consume everything that I and ALTRAN and everything else has developed through the cloud Mongols who are dipping their toes now, but in about a year from now, I dare say will pretty much dominate everything that has to do with telco services.
Thank you. So do you think, Gilad, that the, I mean, you talked about the red hat of open source networking, right? And you said there's perhaps a company out there that might, take on that mantle. I mean, do you think that the time is right for such a company to emerge? I mean, because Red Hat emerged at a particular point in time, right? I mean, Linux had reached a certain level of acceptance, a certain level of maturity, and it was moving to the enterprise. And Red Hat said, okay, enterprise customers are not going to just take Linux, download it, and use it. They need, a company like Red Hat. And Red Hat emerged as the winner in that space. I mean, are we at that point, you think, in terms of networking?
Inder, I wish I knew, because I would definitely either make the seed investment or buy their shares. But I do believe that there's going to be category winners. And the category winners are as follows. Category winners as integrators. And there's going to be regional winners. India is a very, very unique case. This is why we spend our time with this partnership with Sterlite and participated in Open RAN with Bharti and others, because India is a unique case where the market is completely open and the talent pool for guys who can stitch up software together seems to be endless. So India might even have its own category winner. Hint, maybe it's not going to be Geo this time. If you look at the global scale, there are players such as VMware, with Sachin in one of his hats could probably talk about, and they're trying to bring in this 5G operating system approach. But at the end of the day, I don't believe that in the current world there's going to be a new Red Hat. And as my prediction is, and it's going to be the big cloud companies who are just gulping up the entire telco, the entire world of IT in general. So they're going to gulp this thing up as well. And, if you look at the market cap of Google, Amazon, and Azure, sitting already at 6 or 7 trillion, then any category winner that may emerge will just simply be acquired by these guys. So I don't think we should be depressed about that, but we should understand and embrace it. So I think each one of us sitting in this panel or sitting in the audience needs to figure out what is his cloud native strategy. And if it doesn't have one, he better have one. There might be pockets, again, as we described, some regional pockets, certain operators, potentially AT&T, potentially the folks at Rakuten with their very aggressive, somewhat flamboyant approach. But at the end of the day, at scale, the open source, the Open RAN, all lead, and the white box are eventually all lead to cloud native and cloud providers. That's the way I see it. It might be a little bit simplistic, but I think we're going to see that more and more in the next months and years.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened at the data center, right? I mean, and I think pretty much the same trend will occur in this world as well. Raymond, would you like to share your viewpoint?
Okay. Yes. I mean, I more or less agree with Gilad's assessment there. And I think you also have to look more carefully at the two components, whether it's the RAN or the core network. from the pure perspective today, assuming that we did have a Red Hat that was able to integrate the software and guarantee the resilience and the good functioning of the protocol component from the perspective of the respecting the standard for a production large scale network, I think today it is entirely feasible that the core network could go that direction. I mean, if you look what's emerging in the context of a TIP project, it's called the Open Core Networks, which is driven heavily by Facebook and also by operators like Rakuten and others. They are going to put together a production grade for tier 1 networks version of the 3GPP 5G core network. That's at least the intent in a very short amount of time, and they will definitely benefit from the coronavirus to make that even harder to avoid. But as Gilad was saying, this is driven heavily by Facebook, and there may be other cloud providers in that initiative as well. And I think there's no difficulty in putting together a production ready core network solution today. What is out there today is not ready for that. If you look at what came out of Open Air Interface, one of the difficult components, the MME, that was absorbed into Facebook's first initiative called Magma, which is a production-ready piece of software, but that is targeting niche networks. It's not targeting the tier 1 operator networks, but it is production-ready today, and it is being deployed in some rural-type networks, perhaps in India, I don't know, but definitely in South America. And that has open source components. One of them actually came from Open Air Interface, but it wasn't. It was something that was hardened by a team of engineers that was working with Facebook. When it comes to the RAN, I think the same is true for the upper parts of the RAN. If we're talking about the CU, that definitely could be today derived from open source. It's just a question of putting the right teams together to make a production version of things that are already out there. And perhaps some very strong software houses are going to finally go that route if they have people that are mandating them to do it. So basically what I see happening is everything is going to squash down to the lower parts of the DU, where the more traditional vendors are still going to hold on to that for a very long time. Because making that's out of the cloud space in some sense. And making a production-ready massive MIMO or millimeter wave solution that you can deploy continent-wise is not something today that's going to come out of an open source community. Maybe some of the little pieces of software can be taken left and right, but I don't see that today or anytime soon coming out of an open source initiative. I could be wrong. That being said, for maybe some private applications like private 4G, private 5G, that could. And today there is one example of that coming out of Open Air Interface. Our partner Fujitsu has derived a product for certain niche applications in Japanese IoT networks of a private LTE solution that they couple with their server business in order to provide a end-to-end Fujitsu solution for a particular application. That could be an initial source for open source, but definitely anything that excludes the heavy duty DU electronics and the connection with the massively deployed radio units left and right, I think is definitely possible today.
Okay, that's great. Perhaps Debabrata, would you like to round it out by giving your perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Inder. I'm Debabrata Das. I'm a professor in IIIT Bangalore, and I'm heading the lab called Networking and Communication Research Lab. And recently, a national mission in interdisciplinary cyber physical system from DST, a project I'm heading for Open RAN with my colleagues from to IITs and IIT Hyderabad, IIT Bhilai, and also IIIT. We are together working on that direction. And coming to your nice question, which you have put, that whether this Open RAN and open source is a reality or myth. Let me announce, I agree with all the previous speakers, but I'll stress on a couple of points more, because those are the real deployment practically for operator point of view. What I felt is that, as you know, this disaggregation of the network component will bring in a lot of players into this game called ORAN and open source. And as a lot of players will come in, and there are multiple modules are there, as we have heard already nice talks by our keynote speakers, starting from this radio head, then followed by the baseband, and then followed by this MAC layers and all kind of things, and different units are there, like RU, DUs, and also the control plane, management plane, and all. So the most important thing will be here is that as the multiple players are there, multiple modules are there, each player will optimize according to different applications. But another module I'm bringing in from another player. So now the question lies is from top to bottom, means from top to my southbound interfaces has to be optimized. So the integrator has to play a very big role, from which others two speakers said very nicely, Gilad and others said. So the integrator has to understand each modules and how they're operating, and so many applications in the 5G, which is from a huge number of applications, where the operator has to feel confident, and before that integrator has to bring in those things and optimize, show the results of performance, because every application needs an end-to-end delay, throughputs, and all kind of things. So SLA, service level agreement, when an operator goes for a business, at that time, so operator will ask this integrator, hey, are you ready with this? So then these people who are developing this open source or open module has to be cooperative with that. So now I'm coming to the second point. For that, we need complete understanding with these all players to go for a standardization of the interfaces. So these standardizations, open source standardizations and interfaces standardization, along with the integrators understanding and integrating, will play a major role to convince the operator to deploy your components on the field, because the operator will feel comfortable because it is reliable, first of all, and it is scalable with respect to India and across the globe. So this is to start with, to bring it to the reality. These are the things we have to do. However, there are some lab level, and recently Verizon has done some testings on the field. Lab level test fields are available with multiple vendors modules. However, it has to go through these phases over the time. Over to Inder.
Thank you, Debabrata. I think that's very insightful. I guess the general sense I'm getting is that obviously there's a strong role for integrators and curation of the software. The taking raw open source, is probably unlikely. But also it sounds like the parts where open source can play a role, it maybe isn't the things which are tied into electronic or radio innovation, because that's probably likely to be proprietary. But perhaps some of the other aspects can be open source and are perhaps ready for open source deployment. I mean, that's sort of the sense I'm getting from the team. Let me change gears a little bit. Ask a slightly different question. This is a standards. TSD is a standards body, and very interested in the emergence of standards and how standards are created. Is open source potentially the new way of building standards? I mean, maybe it's not necessarily the code that actually gets deployed, but it creates a reference implementation that becomes a standard rather than actually going and specifying an interface. Is that perhaps another benefit or another aspect of open source that we should consider as a standards organization, an alternative way of creating standards? I don't know if Gilad is shaking his head. Perhaps you would like to.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. I think, first of all, it's really about the acceleration of standards and deployments. And I think what we are experiencing now in 5G is that for the first time, I think, as far as I remember, in the telecommunication era, the 3GPP is actually way behind. So historically, everything we did was about following what would be the oracles, the geniuses at 3GPP dish out to us as telco providers. Then we would rush to develop them. Operators would rush to test them, or not rush sometimes. And some of them, some of these novel ideas were dead in the water before they ever took off. And I don't want to get into the IMS example and spatial streams in LTE. So I think what the beauty is of open source is, rather than talking and then waiting for 2 years to see the effect, these open source communities can give us a show and tell of the future ahead of the curve. And again, if you follow 3GPP today, many of the times, whether they fail, they may not admit it, they're actually now following ORAN, they're following OMAN, and they're really playing a catch-up game. So definitely open source, and we talked about it in the pre-briefing, right? I'm aware of a company that built a whole RAN strategy with just 2 guys, and now it may never be scalable really, but they've proven a lot of things that big companies were saying are impossible. So open source, open communities create faster acceleration and innovation, and standard bodies should be well advised to follow up what they do. I know it was a previous session yesterday, and I don't know if this is the right forum, but in telco specifically, also the open spectrum in many countries that allowed open spectrum in places like the industrial space are actually going to accelerate innovation beyond the operator and 10 providers. So I don't know if I completely managed to answer your question, but it's really about the can do and let's do now approach of open source, which is really disrupting this market.
Any other perspective on the?
So can I add to it what he said?
Yeah, go ahead.
See, this is a very difficult proposition, because the open source software standardizations has to be done. It has to be done. Why? Because you see the telecom, which was there only voice, as we know, or SMS for a certain time, has now using this infrastructure for very critical communications with a very stringent delays, like for your robotic kind of applications, or a driverless car coming on over the 5G and all, where the delays will be less than few milliseconds. So if I look at this given example, you see this as an open source platform. Say, and now, with all due respect, it is a great platform called open source, called Android, but it has over the time bloated up. Bloated up means went on adding lot of things to accommodate a lot of applications, but it has become slowed down the system because there was a problem. So, but in telecom, infrastructure delay is very, very sensitive end to end. So in the open source, the standardization, for that I'm coming to the point now, the standardization has to take care in a such a way that that software along with the hardware has to be optimized in a such a way that it should work very efficiently. So open source standardization has to come in with an action plan, along with that integrating all the application over the 5G, but it has to work in a very efficient way. So that is my will be a challenge for the standard body, which is open source coming in.
Anyone else? I
can.
Yeah, please.
We've had this discussion over the last few years in several workshops that were organized with IISc. And I think the general conclusion is that the standards bodies definitely have to start becoming much more aware of how they can exploit open source communities to shorten the standardization cycle. In fact, insert some of these communities in prototyping initiatives, and also in testing initiatives, definitely to harmonize some of the testing procedures with open source communities. And that has happened actually even in the context of earlier generations in 2G and 3G. There were initiatives like that in the past. But again, it also depends on the types of networks, the parts of the network that you're looking at. When we go up into the core network and all of the service architectures, I think this has to happen already, because the architectures are going in the direction of cloud native approaches, and that is heavily dominated today by open source communities. So the standards bodies absolutely have to master this. And I think it did start at the very beginning of 5G. The ITU had several mandates to reach out to the open source communities to understand all of these procedures better. When you go down to the lower layers, in particular in the RAN, where it can be extremely beneficial, is really to have different companies that are proposing ideas inside of 3GPP have a common platform to showcase their ideas. And that too will aid, in addition to the standard methodologies for evaluating the procedures, which are it's a very well-oiled machine, 3GPP, when it comes to actually putting out the specification of the lower layers. Open source is not going to help, other than accelerate it a little bit and maybe put some visibility on other actors inside of 3GPP rather than the main drivers of the IPR today. But that's actually going to require something also from the open source community. And one of the reasons in Open Air Interface we've adopted a 3GPP friendly license is precisely for that reason. So that we as a research institute or other research institutes like in India, like the IISc or IIT Hyderabad that are working with us, can also have a say inside the algorithmic component of a 3GPP system. The open source could provide us a voice to actually show what we're doing and have the software executed on industry prototype platforms to highlight our work. So it can open up the standards process to smaller players as well.
That's a good point.
My humble opinion.
No, that is a good point. What open source license do you guys use to distribute?
Well, today the open source the license is very much in spirit like an Apache license. So in the sense that you can combine it with closed source software. But for the contributors of the software, it protects their intellectual property. So it comes with a FRAND clause, very similar to the contributions that you make when you provide your procedures to the 3GPP for performance evaluation. You have to you adhere to this fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory clause. That's part of the open air interface software today. So that means that the people that are contributing to 3GPP can also contribute to the open source community. If you didn't have that, you could not coexist with people that are trying to monetize their intellectual property. So that is the key thing, and there are a lot of people today that are, in particular, some of the companies like the big cloud companies that are actually in very, very strict opposition to this concept, because basically I don't think they want the intellectual property to be monetized anymore. I think it makes it's not interesting from their business perspective. So that is the other thing with open source. If you really want to bring it close to the key components of the 3GPP system, that part has to be understood. Either we adhere to the intellectual property policies of 3GPP, or you do something in complete opposition to the 3GPP. That's a choice that you have to make.
Or you can also, I mean, for example, in the SDN world, right? I mean, what was defined is the notion of a controller, right, with well-architected APIs. And the idea is what's below those APIs, southbound of those APIs was open and was part of the platform, open source. But then there was opportunity for innovation and proprietary contributions as applications running on top of an open source platform. And if you can create an architecture like that, which separates out, a platform which is open versus applications and added value, which may be proprietary, that sounds to me like the model that
yes, but there you give up the radio access network, basically.
Yeah, that's true.
You haven't. Yeah, please. See, if you look at the specs per se, right? So they don't define the architecture. For example, of SDN content in the architecture and apps below. So that's what forums, initiatives like, say, the TIP or the ORAN are trying to define. So you have these underlying specifications, right, for the CU, DU, right, which are kind of, you need to, the base specification which you implement. But then what you're trying to do is open up the interfaces beyond what is defined in the GPP, so that you have this kind of an abstraction layer where you can start building apps, can bring the innovation, right? So I think these two things go complementary. Now, those other aspects of the openness part may not necessarily be plugged into a spec per se, but what you have is you have the underlying architecture, right, available. You actually open your interfaces, and then you start building these other applications and the framework and infra where a lot of innovation could come in, and then you can start playing with the apps, building out what are use cases you want to develop. So that's why I think it's a kind of complementing, not really like open source or open initiatives, right? Not really open source, open initiatives, right? Work, co-work, or coexist with the specs. So that's a model.
Thank you.
Professor, Dr. Inder, there's one question on the chat group, if I may. I think it's related to open source and who in the community would contribute to it. How does one monitor it, and does it become like a Linux foundation or TM forum kind of a thing, or how do you bring consistency and development?
Well, this is sort of related to the governance of open source, right? I mean, yeah, I don't know. You guys want to comment on that? I mean, are there things unique in the network and telco space that you think will make governance, creating communities harder? I mean, I think the governance models are kind of well understood in perhaps other areas, but in this space, is there something special, different?
I think, if I may, I think some of us may be getting this discussion wrong. Open source, the last time I checked, the open source community was about 40 million strong, and I think through COVID, with the unemployment, it's probably about 44 million people. And these individuals don't adhere to. That's why a lot of them are open source contributors. For them, monetization is gratification. The fact that somebody's using their open source, a lot of them use open source in order to get a better job. So the open source community is much more sporadic and chaotic than we can imagine. So we should not try to tame and control open source. But rather see how we ride the open source wave. So we got to have a lot of humility in that respect, and the monetization factors and the steering and intellectual property. These are terminologies that come from the corporate world. So these two. So while I do agree that corporates have now stopped fearing open source and embracing that, we shouldn't be vain enough to believe that we can impact open source. And open source developers go to where the challenge is. So if they believe 5G is cool, we will see a surge in development of 5G open source. If they don't think it's cool, it's not going to happen. And this is something that we should all kind of bear in mind.
Sure, great. That's great. Sorry to disrupt this flow, but I think I'm getting notification on closing this session. Yeah. I think so. If there are any closing remarks from the panel or in there, if you want to. Yeah.
Well, I was actually going to ask maybe a question, and then perhaps the panelists can make closing remarks in that context. The question really was, a lot of people think open source provides an opportunity for India, right? And in the Indian vendors, Indian ecosystem, to really emerge and play a role, much more significant role in the 5G space, right? Because it is a disruption, it is something which opens, provides a platform upon which many smaller vendors can build build much more rapidly. I mean, do you think that's the case? I mean, do you think it opens up for the Indian ecosystem? I mean, what is your thought of that? Perhaps we can I don't know, Gilad or Raymond or from an international perspective, and then perhaps you guys can give us your thoughts on that.
Raymond, maybe you should go first.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can have the perspective, but given the example that I said before, particularly to India. I mean, I think in India there are very particular deployment scenarios, and I think there is a lot of opportunity for having more, let's say, tailored deployments to your geography, and there perhaps solutions that are derived from open source communities could be more cost effective for a country like India, at least India of today. I mean, of course, your big cities will still be catered to by the main network providers, but for many of the rural zones, there could be definite solutions there that come from smaller companies that are deriving their products largely from open source.
Can I go ahead in there?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I'm very optimistic in this way of India's industry, and also jointly working academia in India, also international collaborations with other academics. Yes, Indian vendors should develop products based on open source for RAN specifications, and also those other like inside the RAN, CU, DU, all those things we discussed. And also, it is a very competitive going to be if it's everything open RAN. So Indian vendors has to understand that ball game and quickly catch up with that, and with that competitiveness, and that they will do, I'm sure, and it is coming up. And lastly, there has to be a roadmap for the Indian companies, and to come up with the operators. Together with the operator, they will play, because the existing operators infrastructure, they may want to integrate with the new coming open RAN things. So that is a very important thing from operators' comfort zone point of view, which we observed from migration from 3G to 4G, LTE, and all kind of things. So that Indian companies working in this open source and for the 5G RAN, ORAN, and all should see that integration to the existing system and slowly migrating out to the completely open source and open RAN kind of system over the time. So that will be my, I am looking forward to that kind of movement from the Indian companies coming on board.
Thank you. I don't know, Ravikanth, you have a perspective? And then Gilad.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sure. So, see, I'll break into two parts. Okay, so one is the white box, and maybe come to the open source per se, right? So if you look at the expertise available in India, right, we build solutions for our customers. We build the hardware for our customers. We build the software for our customers, right? But what is missing is you have a product which you can actually sell within India and the global market. So that's a big opportunity, right? So when you have this kind of specs, kind of an open hardware specs or open different specifications, making a white box and then positioning, that's one big opportunity, you can see. The second is on the open source per se, right? Now, once again, I break into two parts. One, the core part of it, and then the applications part of it, right? And the applications part, we talk about a lot of these machine learning apps, right? And then using machine learning techniques in building those apps. Big opportunities once again, which is available, because once you have the ORAN, you start exposing those APIs, right? So you have a lot of opportunity and potential, right? And now whether what kind of platform uses one story, but what app you build on top of it becomes right. You have a reference baseline, kind of an open source or a proprietary, but that's another big opportunity where we could have. Not to mention the other piece of the RAN itself. So I'd say three pieces. One, the solutioning itself, the white box is one piece. The apps and the machine learning concepts to apply is another big opportunity. The third is the solution itself, where based on the kind of a smaller medium role.
Great. Thank you. Gilad, you want to help us wrap things up?
Yep. Very simple. India has the ability to become a global power in telecommunication because of open RAN and softwarization of the network. So the big key integrators, your Infosys of the world, but also the Sterlites of the world. That's without question. Open source is actually an equalizer to smaller economies that can, smaller and smaller groups that can come up with innovative products. So I think it's probably neutral for India, but certainly what open source does, it accelerates market adoption. So indirectly, it's good for India, but again, it's not the obvious, because what open source, again, in my opinion, does kind of levels the field between very small shops that could sit in Copenhagen with 20 guys over a big software shop sitting in Bangalore. So again, we have to be realistic of what open source means and how it's being consumed at the end. That's the best.
There are a lot of small guys in India too.
Absolutely, and again, this is the problem with these generalizations. But I'm just saying that the key for India is the software and the open RAM. The open source is sort of like a trend that needs to be treated, and the good thing about good software companies is they can pick and choose the right element in their internal R&D of open source versus development. I think that those are the things that indirectly would affect the competitive landscape in India.
Great, thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to Rajesh, and I guess he can wrap it up.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Inder. I think we could have just gone on and on. So such a great panel, and the topic is so relevant to everything that we're doing right now. So thanks a lot to the entire panel and all the speakers. Just to close it out, I'll just hand it back to Bindu. Again, thanks to all the panelists and speakers here. It's fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Rajesh and panelists. It has been such an interesting session, and we still have 72 folks with us. I think we've just scratched the surface, and I just wanted to announce that tomorrow and day after and on Friday, we have again equally interesting topics on AI, ML, rural and remote data connectivity, security, data management and privacy. And last, we'll wrap the conference with a mega session on self-reliant India. So do join us again tomorrow at 4:50 p.m. IST. You can look up the details of our sessions for tomorrow on our website. Go to the program schedule tab, and you will find the link to launch the session from that tab. So thank you very much. Namaste, and see you tomorrow. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Have a nice good night and good day. Some parts of the world. Yeah.